Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. Oh, honey, I still feel the chill when I think back to that evening, the kind of chill that has nothing to do with the thermostat and everything to do with a cold realization settling deep in your soul. My name is Alara, and I'm a woman who, until that moment, thought she'd raised her daughter, Serafina, with all the love and goodness the world could offer, a love that was supposed to be a comfortable blanket in my later years, not a shroud. I live in a quiet, manicured pocket of the suburbs called Willow Creek Heights, where the biggest scandal is usually just poorly maintained landscaping, and the days mostly drift by in a haze of gardening, crosswords, and the occasional visit from my grandkids. That night, however, was anything but quiet. Serafina and her husband, Theron, had come over for what I thought was a typical, slightly obligatory Sunday dinner. I'd spent the afternoon baking my famous lemon cake, trying to ignore the subtle shift in Serafina's demeanor lately, a new, forced cheerfulness that felt less like joy and more like impatience, like a countdown timer running in the background of her gaze whenever she looked at me. I was just fetching my reading glasses from the bedroom, stepping out into the hushed hallway carpet that absorbed all sound, when I heard the low, urgent murmur of their voices spilling out from the kitchen, a sound I initially dismissed as just a private marital moment. I stopped, not because I intended to eavesdrop, never that, but because one word, one horrible, sharp-edged word, sliced through the domestic calm: money. Serafina's voice was tight, strained, unlike her usual melodic tone, and I instinctively retreated a step, pressing my back against the cool, textured wallpaper. Theron was speaking now, his voice a gravelly, controlled baritone, discussing valuations and probate, words that made no sense in the context of my simple suburban life, yet felt immediately threatening. He was talking about the house, my house, this anchor of my life built by my late husband, and suddenly, Serafina cut him off, her voice dropping to a near-silent hiss, but the acoustics of the hallway were cruel that night, carrying the sound straight to my ear. I strained to hear, my heart already hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, convinced I was about to hear something mundane, something I could laugh off later, something to dismiss the mounting anxiety that had been clinging to me like a damp cloak. I mentally rehearsed what I would say when I walked in, a breezy comment about the price of eggs or the weather, trying to erase the moment, but the moment wouldn't let itself be erased. It was insistent, demanding. Then came the line, the 7 syllables that would shatter my reality and redefine my relationship with the child I carried for 9 months and nurtured for decades. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted in anger, but it was delivered with a chilling, clinical certainty that made the blood run cold in my veins and left me momentarily paralyzed, unable to move or breathe. Mom won't be around much longer, Theron. We just have to be patient. The ground beneath me, the solid foundation of familial love and trust, seemed to give way. It wasn't the sound of grief or concern, it was the sound of logistical planning, of cold, ruthless calculation. My daughter, Serafina, my own flesh and blood, was discussing my expiration date like she was checking a calendar for an upcoming appointment she found inconvenient but necessary. The immediate shock gave way to a wave of dizzying panic, a profound, visceral terror that made my knees weak and my hands clammy. I leaned heavily against the wall, fighting the urge to gasp, to scream, or to simply collapse, knowing that any sudden noise would alert them to my presence and jeopardize whatever fragile understanding I could grasp from this nightmare unfolding in my own home. My mind raced, trying to find a benign explanation, a dark joke, a misunderstanding, but the tone, that flat, non-emotional tone, betrayed any possibility of innocence. I realized in that frozen, terrible minute that I couldn't confront them. Not yet. The look in Serafina's eyes when she had spoken, a certain hard edge I'd noticed but dismissed as stress, now came flooding back, making me realize this was not a moment of weakness, but a statement of intent, a part of a larger, hidden truth. I needed proof, solid, irrefutable evidence that could stand up in the bright light of a courtroom, not just the flimsy, terrifying memory of a whisper in the night. Retreating noiselessly back into my bedroom became my only mission, a movement of silent, desperate stealth. My old joints protested with every carefully placed step, but adrenaline, sharp and potent, was guiding me, muffling the usual aches and pains of age. I closed the door with agonizing slowness, the soft click of the latch sounding like a cannon shot in the sudden silence of the room. My mind, usually slow and reflective, was now firing on all cylinders, sharp and focused with a clarity born of sheer survival instinct, the kind of clarity that only comes when everything you hold dear is threatened. I locked the door and slid a heavy, mahogany-inlaid box in front of it, a pathetic barricade, but one that gave me a moment's illusion of safety, a necessary, childish gesture in the face of this monstrous adult reality. It was then, standing in the middle of my quiet, familiar sanctuary, that the cold realization crystallized into a plan. I needed to record them, to capture their conversations, their true intentions, and their chilling discussions about my inevitable absence. I fumbled in the top drawer of my antique writing desk, past old letters and forgotten trinkets, until my fingers closed around the cold metal of a small, vintage audio recorder I'd bought years ago, ostensibly to record bird calls from my nature journal, but it had remained mostly unused. It was a beautiful, discreet little device, no bigger than a matchbox, easily concealed. My hands, still trembling from the shock, now moved with purposeful, desperate speed. I checked the batteries, inserted a fresh microSD card, and tested the recording function, the red light blinking steadily, a silent, unforgiving witness. The sheer audacity of what I was about to do, spying on my own daughter, was nauseating, but the alternative, simply waiting for her chilling prophecy to come true, was unthinkable. The cake was still cooling on the counter, the dinner plates were still on the table, and yet, the entire landscape of my life had been fundamentally altered. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the air tasting metallic with fear and resolve, and knew, with a certainty that settled the churning in my stomach, that the game had changed. I was no longer just mom, I was the unwilling star of a very dangerous, very real-life drama. The days that followed were a surreal, waking nightmare, a careful, almost unbearable performance where I had to pretend that the world hadn't tilted violently on its axis. Serafina, sensing perhaps that I had become more withdrawn, or maybe just operating on her own internal schedule, suddenly amplified her visits and her displays of affection, a sudden, almost aggressive interest in my well-being that only deepened my suspicion. She started dropping by unannounced, bringing me store-bought flowers with the plastic wrapper still awkwardly clinging to them and prepared meals that, though technically helpful, felt suspiciously like checking a box on a sinister to-do list. Before that terrible Sunday, she'd been politely distant, focused on her career as a high-end realtor and the demands of raising her own teenagers, which was understandable, but this new, suffocating attention felt jarring, a costume she couldn't quite wear comfortably. She'd hover in the kitchen while I made my simple breakfast, asking pointed questions about my investments, my late husband's pension, and, most disturbingly, the frequency of my doctor's appointments and the medications I took. These conversations were agonizing, forcing me to maintain an outward mask of placid, slightly forgetful old age while my internal alarm bells were screaming at full volume. "Just checking in, Mom," she'd chirp, her voice too high-pitched, too saccharine, while her eyes darted around the room, assessing, calculating. One afternoon, she spent nearly an hour talking about the cost of assisted living facilities, casually mentioning how important it was to have a financial plan in place, just in case. I played the part of the slightly bewildered, grateful mother, nodding slowly, sighing occasionally, and offering vague, non-committal responses, carefully deflecting her increasingly detailed inquiries about the contents of my safety deposit box and the name of my estate attorney. I told her I hadn't changed anything since her father passed, a half-truth that seemed to temporarily appease her, but the seed of doubt, the deep, dark suspicion she had planted, was now fully rooted and growing at a terrifying rate. I felt like I was navigating a minefield, every casual conversation a potential trap, every hug a test of my composure, every forced laugh a betrayal of the terrifying truth I held silently within my heart. My primary focus, however, was the recorder. I had to choose the right spot, a place where the sound would be clear but the device itself would be invisible, even to a determined search. After several covert experiments using my own voice and then having the television on low, I settled on a perfect location, tucked securely behind a stack of thick, leather-bound photography albums on the bottom shelf of the living room bookcase, right next to the antique rotary phone that was never used. The albums, dusty and rarely touched, provided both cover and acoustic dampening, creating a small, invisible sound chamber. The room, which served as their usual meeting place with Theron, was large, airy, and full of heavy, sound-absorbing furniture, making the recorder's placement even more crucial. I learned to activate it with a practiced, seamless gesture just minutes before Serafina or Theron arrived, my hand brushing the back of the shelf as I ostensibly reached for a magazine or straightened a picture frame. The little red light, my silent accomplice, would begin its steady, ominous blink, signaling the start of the recording, a cold, hard evidence trail I was meticulously building against the people I was supposed to love and trust the most in the world. The mental and emotional strain of this deception was colossal. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, replaced by late-night agonizing over what I'd heard and what I might hear next, and early morning meticulous planning. I had to manage the device, ensuring the batteries were fresh and the storage was clear, a complicated technical dance for a woman who still struggled to program the coffee maker. I started keeping a private journal, hidden beneath my mattress, documenting every visit, every strange question, every suspicious comment Serafina or Theron made, creating a parallel, written record to supplement the electronic one. This journal wasn't just for evidence, it was a way to maintain my sanity, to anchor myself in reality when the sheer, unbelievable scale of the betrayal threatened to overwhelm me. I wrote down the names of their friends they suddenly started mentioning, the realtors they suggested I meet, the financial planners they were so keen on introducing me to, every detail, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed, because I knew that in a conspiracy, every piece matters, every casual suggestion is a carefully placed brick in the wall of their plot. I had to become an actress, a spy, a detective, all roles for which I was entirely unqualified, but the stakes were too high, my life and my independence were on the line, and the primal need to survive fueled every single move I made. The worst part of this painful new reality was the utter isolation. I couldn't tell anyone, not my few remaining friends, not the kind lady next door, and certainly not my lawyer, whom Serafina had already started charming with her sudden interest in my affairs. The moment I told someone, the plot, whatever it was, would move from the shadowy realm of my suspicion into the bright, dangerous light of action, and I wouldn't be ready. I knew Serafina would deny everything, her professional charm a powerful weapon, and without the recordings, it would just be the word of a frail old woman against her successful, respected daughter. I was completely alone in this silent war, trapped in my own home, constantly performing for my own child. The silence of the house, once a comfort, now felt oppressive, the walls closing in, making every tick of the grandfather clock feel like a hammer blow counting down the final seconds. That night, as I lay in bed, the scent of the uneaten lemon cake still faint in the air, I felt a resolve harden within me. I was 72 years old, not easily dismissed, and though they saw me as a soft target, a gentle lamb ready for the slaughter, they had severely underestimated the grit of a woman who had survived a lifetime of challenges, including widowhood, recession, and the relentless march of time. I decided then and there that I would not just wait and see, I would listen, I would gather, and when the time was right, I would strike back with the cold, hard proof of their own damning words. My first few attempts at recording were frustrating failures, a comedy of errors that would have been funny if the stakes weren't so desperately high. The sound quality was often muffled by the leather albums, or I'd forget to turn the volume up, capturing only faint, indistinct echoes of conversation that sounded more like the ghosts of arguments than actual, concrete evidence. I listened back to hours of innocuous chatter, the clinking of coffee cups, the rustle of newspapers, Serafina discussing her latest real estate commission, and Theron complaining about the rising cost of petrol, all of it useless, mundane noise that only served to increase my paranoia and exhaustion. I realized I needed a better system, a more deliberate setup that accounted for the natural, casual movements of people in a room. I spent a whole afternoon researching small, directional microphones online, learning technical terms like omnidirectional and frequency response, feeling like a secret agent whose mission was not to save the world, but simply to save her own life and legacy from the hands of her greedy offspring. This was the terrifying absurdity of my situation, a grandmother in Willow Creek Heights, planning a counter-espionage operation against her own family. My solution was ingenious, if I do say so myself, and it utilized the most overlooked, non-threatening object in the room, a large, ceramic pot filled with a vibrant, overgrown philodendron that sat right on the edge of the coffee table, a perfect centerpiece. The dense foliage, I reasoned, would absorb sound from all angles and hold the recorder securely. I found a way to tape the matchbox-sized recorder to the underside of one of the largest leaves, angling the microphone towards the two antique armchairs where Serafina and Theron always sat. I covered the exposed wires with dark florist's moss, making the setup virtually undetectable, even to a close inspection. The first time I tested this new placement, the difference was astounding. I could hear the crinkle of Serafina's skirt, the slight clearing of Theron's throat, and every word, every nuance of their conversation, as if they were speaking directly into my ear. This small success, this technical victory, injected a much-needed shot of confidence into my weary spirit, reminding me that even at my age, even in my isolation, I still had agency, cunning, and the ability to fight back against the darkness that threatened to consume me. The real breakthrough came the following Tuesday, a day Serafina claimed she was meeting her husband for a quick business lunch, an excuse that had become a familiar pattern in their recent, frequent visits. Instead of leaving immediately after exchanging pleasantries, as she usually did, she lingered, offering to help me water the plants, a gesture I knew was purely tactical. I played along, offering her the watering can, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest, watching her hands move around the very plant that held my only defense. She ran her fingers across the damp, ceramic rim of the pot, oblivious to the tiny machine hidden just inches away, and then, in a casual move that made me flinch internally, she repositioned the largest leaf, unknowingly exposing the microphone even more perfectly to the center of the room. It was a moment of pure, cinematic luck, a gift from the universe that I quickly accepted, offering a small, silent prayer of thanks to whatever guardian angel was looking out for the naive elderly in their own homes. She finally left with a quick, air-kissed goodbye, her scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air, a final, fragrant layer of deceit. I retreated to my bedroom, feigning a sudden need for a nap, and waited. The house was silent, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that precedes a storm. I listened to the muffled sounds of the neighborhood, a distant lawnmower, the barking of the neighbor's spaniel, but inside my head, I could only hear the crushing silence of the empty living room, waiting for the conversation I knew was coming. Just 20 minutes later, I heard the faint thud-thud-thud of the garage door opening and closing, and then the distinct, heavier footsteps of two people entering the living room. They hadn't gone out for lunch at all, they had just been sitting in the car down the street, waiting for me to be safely confined in my room. The raw audacity of their deception, the casual way they used my home as their secret planning room, ignited a cold, steady fury that replaced the initial fear, giving me the strength to endure what I was about to hear. They settled into the armchairs, the cushions sighing under their weight, and the recording started. I didn't need to be there, the microphone was my ears, the SD card my memory, and the truth, whatever its dark shape, was about to be laid bare, captured in cold, undeniable audio. The initial sound was the rustle of papers, followed by Theron's deep sigh, the kind of sigh that suggests boredom with a tedious but necessary task. She didn't bite on the attorney referral, Serafina, he stated flatly, the disappointment palpable in his voice. Serafina immediately snapped back, her voice laced with frustration, an unmasking of the fake pleasantness she wore in my presence. Of course, she didn't, Theron. She's not an idiot, she's old, which is entirely different. She knows her own attorney. We need to focus on the house. The way she spat out the word old like an insult, a disqualifying condition, stung more than any direct confrontation ever could. They began discussing the details, the logistics of selling the house quickly, the various shell corporations they might use to hide the bulk of the proceeds, and how to transfer the investment accounts without triggering any immediate red flags. They talked about my life, my health, my remaining years, with the detached professionalism of two business partners discussing the liquidation of a burdensome asset. It was the longest, most painful 20 minutes of my life, every word a fresh cut, but I didn't move, I didn't cry, I simply listened, allowing the horrifying details to etch themselves onto my memory and, more importantly, onto that tiny, unwavering recording device. The truth, in all its ugly, unvarnished reality, was finally mine. Retrieving the recorder after they left was a tense, elaborate ritual, a performance that required patience and perfect timing. I waited a full hour after the sound of their car pulling away had completely faded, ensuring there would be no surprise returns or forgotten items that would expose my secret. Once the coast was clear, I moved with a practiced precision born of desperation, my old hands now surprisingly steady as they reached into the thick foliage, carefully detaching the device from the underside of the leaf. I scurried back to my bedroom, locked the door, and sank onto my bed, the small, cold machine feeling heavy and significant in my palm. The moment of truth always arrived with a sickening wave of nausea and profound dread. I plugged in my headphones, the cheap foam earpieces a stark contrast to the gravity of the information they were about to deliver, and pressed play. The silence stretched out, punctuated by a faint white noise, and then, the crisp, chilling clarity of their voices filled my head, an immediate, irrefutable confirmation of my worst fears. The first session had given me context, this one provided the actionable, horrifying details I needed to truly understand the scope of their plot. "She won't need the money for long, Serafina. You said it yourself," the doctor gave a guarded prognosis. This was Theron, his voice smooth and unsettlingly calm, the voice of a man rationalizing a cruel act. The phrase guarded prognosis hit me like a physical blow. They had been to my doctor, or at least spoken to someone at the office, gathering information about my health, my heart condition, my slight memory fog, and weaponizing it against me. My mind flashed back to the form Serafina had insisted I sign for insurance purposes a few months prior, forms that now, in retrospect, seemed far more sinister than simple paperwork. Serafina's response was sharp and dismissive. "It's the principal, Theron. I'm her only child. That house, that money, it's ours. It's a waste sitting in her low-yield accounts. She hasn't traveled in a decade." The sheer entitlement in her tone, the casual disregard for my right to my own life and resources, was breathtaking in its cruelty. She saw my existence not as a life to be cherished, but as an inefficient storage unit for her future wealth, an obstacle to be patiently navigated until it disappeared. They then moved on to the technicalities, discussing a plan to introduce a friendly financial advisor, a man named Cale, who would convince me to move my liquid assets into an aggressive, poorly secured high-risk fund. The risk, of course, wasn't for me, it was for the principal, which they planned to drain via large, hidden fees and strategically timed withdrawals, leaving me with nothing but the paper losses. "Cale is in," Theron confirmed. "He'll mention the market potential, the tax benefits for legacy planning. The key is to make her think she's being smart with her money, preparing for the future, not simply handing it over." It was a meticulously crafted, devastating strategy, leveraging my age, my trust, and my perceived naivety against me. The plan wasn't to wait for me to die, the plan was to systematically bankrupt me and then, when I was completely dependent, to move me into a low-cost, state-funded facility, all while maintaining the appearance of a dutiful, concerned daughter. The empowerment they felt in these conversations, the giddiness of their greed, was almost as horrifying as the details of the plot itself. I stopped the recording, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the mattress to steady myself. The plan was not just theft, it was emotional, psychological, and financial abuse, a calculated effort to strip me of my dignity and security while I was still alive. That night, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't even think clearly. I got up, found my journal, and began transcribing the most damning parts of the conversation, word for word, forcing myself to relive the trauma to create a perfectly detailed record. Kale. High-risk fund. Legacy planning. The names and key phrases were now concrete evidence, not just whispers of my fear. I knew that simply having the audio wouldn't be enough. I needed to know who this Kale was, which high-risk fund they were talking about, and how they planned to execute the transfers. My role had shifted again. I was no longer just gathering passive evidence. I had to actively research, to anticipate their next moves, and to find the vulnerabilities in their elaborate scheme before they could strip me of everything I had. The next morning, armed with the names and the horrifying knowledge, I did something I hadn't done in years. I logged into my late husband's old desktop computer, a machine I only used for solitaire and weather reports. I started with Kale, searching his name, his financial advisory firm, and any related news. It took hours of patient, painstaking work, navigating unfamiliar websites and confusing financial jargon, but eventually, I found him, Kale Roth, a licensed advisor with a surprisingly clean public record, but a notable history of short, aggressive tenures at various firms that ended abruptly, leaving behind a trail of unhappy, elderly clients. It wasn't definitive proof of his corruption, but it was a pattern, a red flag big enough to fly in a hurricane. I felt a surge of cold, analytical energy. The fear was still there, but it was now channeled into purpose. They thought I was a slow, senile target, but they had forgotten that beneath the soft cardigan and the forgetful sighs was a mind that had run a household, managed a budget, and built a life from scratch. I was an unlikely warrior, but I was armed with their own words and a newfound, burning determination to survive. While Serafina was the driving force behind the emotional betrayal, fueled by a relentless, corrosive greed, Theron, my son-in-law, was the chilling logistical mind, the architect of the practical cruelty. He rarely spoke much during their visits, maintaining a veneer of respectful, slightly detached professionalism, always deferring to Serafina when in my presence, but in the recordings, he was calculating, methodical, and frighteningly specific. He approached my ruin like a complex project management assignment, detailing timelines, risk assessments, and exit strategies. His focus was always on the mechanical side of the theft, discussing things like document forgery, the specific legal loopholes they planned to exploit, and the fastest way to get the necessary signatures without arousing suspicion. His voice, stripped of its public charm, was cold and flat, utterly devoid of any human empathy, which somehow made his betrayal feel even more monstrous than Serafina's emotionally charged entitlement. One afternoon's recording provided a terrifying new detail. They weren't just planning to bankrupt me, they were laying the groundwork for a declaration of my mental incapacity. Theron was discussing a strategy to hire a friendly medical assessor, someone who would note my age, the small instances of confusion I occasionally displayed, and the pre-existing heart condition, and use them to construct a case for me being unfit to manage my own affairs. We established the pattern now, Serafina, I heard him say, with the financial transfers. When she realizes what's happening and objects, we pivot to incapacity. It makes the theft look like a necessary intervention. This was the true horror, the one that threatened to steal not just my money, but my very self, my autonomy, my identity. It was a plan that turned me into a ghost, an empty shell, legally stripped of my rights while I was still breathing and fully aware of the injustice. The most gut-wrenching moment of that particular recording was when Serafina questioned the harshness of the plan, a fleeting, momentary flicker of the daughter I once knew. "Isn't that cruel, Theron?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Theron's reply was immediate and brutally effective in silencing her fleeting conscience. "It's efficient, Serafina. She's living on borrowed time and wasting capital. We're securing our future, the children's college fund. Think of it as forced, necessary evolution." The chilling way he used buzzwords like efficient and evolution to sanitize their theft and betrayal cemented my understanding. Theron was the true villain, the dark shadow pulling the strings, leveraging Serafina's own festering resentment and greed into a tangible, criminal plot. She was his eager student, ready to discard her own mother for the promise of an easier, more opulent life. The idea that she would sacrifice my well-being for a college fund that could be easily financed through other means was the final, devastating blow to my illusion of her character, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty that I was dealing with two people entirely corrupted by the pursuit of wealth. My counter-strategy had to now address both the financial and the legal components of their plan. The recordings were essential, but I needed a safe way to store them and a way to introduce them to the right people without alerting Serafina or Theron. I had a trusted, small, high-capacity USB drive, which I carefully transferred the damning audio files onto, labeling them with cryptic, innocuous names like Bird Song 1 and Gardening Notes 2. I then wrapped the USB drive in several layers of tissue paper and hid it inside an old, empty spice jar at the very back of my pantry, among the forgotten bottles of nutmeg and cinnamon, a place neither Serafina nor Theron would ever dream of looking. This physical act of safeguarding the evidence was deeply empowering, a small, defiant act of resistance against the forces trying to control me. With the evidence secured, my focus turned to the immediate threat, the financial advisor, Cale. I knew the moment Cale called, or the moment Serafina introduced him, the clock would start ticking faster. I needed an advantage, a lawyer who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation, someone who could act quickly and discreetly. I couldn't use my old family attorney, as Serafina already had him under surveillance, so to speak. Relying on my own research, using a pseudonym and an old burner email account I created, I began contacting legal offices in the next county over, explaining a vague hypothetical scenario, testing the waters, looking for the one person who sounded both competent and trustworthy. I used my landline phone, not my cell, knowing that digital records were easier to trace, and kept the conversations short and clipped, using code words and vague language to obscure the true nature of my distress. My heart hammered with every call, convinced that at any moment, Serafina would walk through the door, but the fear was now secondary to the burning need for action. I was mobilizing, quietly and secretly, preparing for the inevitable, devastating confrontation that would either save my life or confirm my daughter's worst intention. The most crucial, and most difficult, recording came 10 days later. It was a Tuesday evening, a day they usually spent at home, so I was surprised when they arrived unannounced, claiming they were bringing me a gift, a luxurious, oversized cashmere blanket that felt less like a gesture of warmth and more like an early offering for a funeral. They seemed agitated, their usual controlled composure slightly frayed, and I quickly realized this visit was not about pretense, but about finalizing the dark blueprint. Serafina and Theron settled into their customary seats, and I, feigning exhaustion, retired to my room after successfully activating my hidden recorder. The resulting audio was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, the full, unvarnished confession of their intent, a conversation so cold and calculating it defied belief, even after everything I had already heard. It was their moment of overconfidence, their final detailed rehearsal before the curtain was set to rise on my destruction. Theron started the conversation by outlining a strict timeline, a 3-month window they had calculated based on the guarded prognosis and their desire to capitalize on a predicted uptick in the local real estate market. Month 1, Cale moves the liquid assets, he stated, his voice clipped and precise. Month 2, we introduce the Health Management Trust documents, which Serafina signs as co-trustee, giving us control over the house and the non-liquid assets. This is the critical step, Serafina. You must maintain the appearance of being overwhelmed and unable to cope with my mother's financial stress. I could hear Serafina taking rapid, shallow breaths, a sign of her own rising anxiety, but she didn't object. The full scope of their criminal intent was laid bare, a systematic, coordinated attack on every facet of my security, designed to leave me destitute and powerless, unable to fight back against their false narrative of my incompetence. Then came the darkest part, the section of the recording that still haunts my quiet moments, freezing the air in my lungs. They discussed the physical move. Serafina mentioned a facility 200 miles away, in a distant, undesirable part of the state, a place where it would be difficult for my friends to visit and impossible for me to escape or appeal for help. It's a long drive, but it's cheap, and the paperwork says they're equipped for memory care, which plays into the narrative, she explained, her voice hardening with resolve. I heard Theron agree, confirming that the distance would be an advantage in maintaining control over the narrative and preventing any interference from concerned neighbors or friends. They were planning to completely isolate me, to erase my life in Willow Creek Heights, to sever every connection I had built over the last 40 years, all while using the veneer of dutiful care to mask their monstrous greed. The gift of the cashmere blanket suddenly felt less like a gesture and more like a preparatory burial shroud, a sick, twisted symbol of the comfort they were pretending to offer while simultaneously plotting my complete and utter ruin. When the recording ended, I didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been leached out of me, replaced by a cold, searing fury that felt like a protective shield. I played the entire conversation back twice, then 3 times, meticulously transcribing every word, every damning phrase, every cold logistical detail into my journal. The plan was complete. They would financially liquidate me, legally invalidate me, and physically exile me. I had to move faster than their 3-month timeline, and I had to be flawless in my execution. I now had the full blueprint of their crime, and that knowledge was power, but it was also a heavy, terrifying burden. I knew that confrontation was now inevitable, but I needed to execute it in a controlled, irreversible way, a way that would prevent them from covering their tracks or turning the situation back on me with their pre-planned narrative of my mental decline. I immediately got back to work, contacting the lawyer I had been vetting in the next county, a woman named Attorney Solari, and setting up an urgent, discreet meeting. I couldn't meet her at my house, and I couldn't meet her at her office. The risk was too great. I settled on a neutral location, a small, nondescript community library 10 miles away, a place where Serafina, who hated books and loved the spotlight, would never think to look. The meeting was set for the following morning, just 12 hours away, giving me barely enough time to prepare my case and ensure a safe, unnoticed departure and return. I bundled up the USB drive, the heavily annotated journal, and all the relevant financial paperwork, the bank statements, the investment records, the house deed, into an old, seemingly innocent tote bag designed to look like I was just bringing books back. I felt a surge of energy, a fierce, primal resolve that defied my age and my recent emotional trauma. They had underestimated the power of an old woman with nothing left to lose, and in less than a day, their careful, cruel blueprint was about to be obliterated by the cold, hard facts of their own recorded voices. The meeting with Attorney Solari was the first time in months I felt a true, fragile sense of hope. The library was exactly as I'd hoped, quiet, filled with the comforting smell of old paper, and perfectly anonymous. Solari, a woman with sharp, kind eyes and an unflappable demeanor, met me at a secluded table in the archives section. She was younger than Serafina, but radiated a competence that immediately put my racing heart at ease. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I simply opened my tote bag, pulled out the journal, the financial documents, and the small USB drive, and laid them out on the table between us. "My name is Alara Vance," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "and I need you to listen to this, and then I need you to save my life, my financial security, and my dignity from my own daughter and son-in-law." I then recounted the chilling narrative, starting with the overheard whisper, detailing the false pretenses, and explaining the intricate, multi-stage plot to impoverish and institutionalize me. Solari remained completely silent throughout my explanation, her gaze never leaving my face, absorbing every terrifying detail of the emotional and financial betrayal. When I finished, she took the USB drive, pulled a small laptop from her briefcase, and plugged it in. She put on her own headphones and listened to the most crucial segment of the last recording, the conversation detailing the 3-month timeline, the forced incapacity, and the plans for the distant care facility. I watched her face intently, searching for a flicker of disbelief, but I found only a cold, professional anger. When she finally removed the headphones, she leaned back, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice low and steady, "what you have here is not just proof of financial exploitation. It is evidence of attempted conspiracy to commit fraud and potentially, elder abuse. The level of premeditation and detail is astounding. We can stop this. Immediately. Her immediate, decisive action plan was exactly what I needed. First, a total financial lockdown. She would send an immediate, legally binding letter to my bank and all investment firms, citing pending legal action for financial fraud and freezing all movement of funds, requiring both our signatures for any transactions, effectively derailing Kale's first-month strategy. Second, she would immediately file for a restraining order against Serafina and Theron, preventing them from coming to the house, citing the documented threat of forced exile and physical isolation. This would secure my personal safety and strip them of their access to me and the property. Third, and most powerfully, she would contact a trusted detective specializing in financial crimes, presenting the audio recordings as immediate, irrefutable evidence of a criminal plot. This wasn't going to be a simple civil lawsuit, it was going to be a criminal investigation, a necessary and devastating escalation that would completely blindside Serafina and Theron. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but also a deep sadness, a final, necessary severing of the maternal bond. I want them prosecuted, Attorney Solari, I stated clearly. They need to face the full consequence of planning to destroy my life. Not just for me, but for every other person they might attempt to target. I spent the next 2 hours signing documents, transferring power of attorney to Solari for the sole purpose of litigation, and giving her permission to disclose the information to law enforcement. Every signature was a declaration of independence, a final, painful acceptance of the terrible truth about my daughter. Solari then explained the critical next step. The confrontation had to happen on her terms, in a controlled, secure environment where Serafina and Theron could be legally presented with the evidence and simultaneously served with the restraining order and notice of criminal investigation. The plan for the confrontation was brilliant in its simplicity and psychological impact. Solari would arrange a meeting at her office, ostensibly to discuss urgent, unexpected tax matters that required my daughter's attention as my heir apparent, a bait Serafina's greed would never allow her to refuse. I would be there, flanked by Solari and the detective. The trap was set, timed perfectly to catch them in their moment of highest confidence, believing they were still in control of the situation. As I drove back to Willow Creek Heights, I felt a strange mix of terror and exhilaration, the heavy weight of the secret finally lifting, replaced by the cold, exhilarating weight of impending action. The house, which had felt like a suffocating prison for months, now felt like a fortified castle, and I, its lone, determined occupant, was ready for the final, necessary battle. My time as a quiet, unsuspecting victim was officially over, and the time for justice, swift and uncompromising, had finally arrived. The wait for the confrontation was excruciating, a final, terrifying limbo before the inevitable reckoning. With the financial freeze and the legal wheels turning, I was safe, but the emotional cost of that safety was immense. The sheer weight of my daughter's betrayal settled upon me, heavy and suffocating, making every familiar object in the house feel tainted, every memory of her childhood feel like a deliberate lie. I tried to reconcile the sweet, bright-eyed girl I had raised with the cold, ruthless woman on the recordings, but the two images simply refused to merge. The girl loved animals and dreamt of being a teacher. The woman saw her own mother as a stepping stone to financial freedom. The disconnect was a constant, searing pain, a wound that no amount of time or resolution could truly heal, only scar over. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty chairs where they plotted my demise, feeling a profound sense of loneliness that transcended mere physical solitude, a loneliness born of having been utterly, monstrously misunderstood and betrayed by the one person who should have cherished me. I realized the true nature of their crime wasn't just the theft of money, it was the theft of my remaining time and peace. Every visit, every forced smile, every question about my health was a calculated lie, and knowing that every moment of my recent life had been a carefully orchestrated performance was a profound psychological violation. I felt foolish, naive, and deeply, irrevocably saddened that the last chapter of my life, the one I imagined filled with quiet contentment and family warmth, had instead become a cloak and dagger operation against my own blood. I found myself obsessively reviewing the recordings again, not for evidence, but for closure, searching for a single, mitigating word of hesitation or regret from Serafina, a sign that she was merely following Theron's lead and not wholeheartedly participating. But all I found was her impatient greed, her quick agreement to the cruelest parts of the plan, and her unwavering focus on the projected real estate profits. The truth was ugly, complete, and undeniable. She was fully complicit. In an odd, deeply personal gesture, I found myself repeatedly tending to the philodendron that had held my salvation. I talked to it, thanking it for its silence and its service, a bizarre, necessary act of acknowledging the only reliable witness I had in those dark months. It became a strange symbol of my resilience, a green, growing thing that had silently borne the weight of a horrific secret and ultimately helped save its caregiver. I knew that after the dust settled, the memories of the betrayal would remain, a dark stain on my family history, but I also knew that my decision to fight back, to trust my gut, and to rely on my own strength was the only way I could ever move forward with my dignity intact. The empowerment I had felt in the lawyer's office now had to sustain me through this final, emotional trial, demanding that I be a witness to my own confrontation, a necessary step in reclaiming my narrative. Attorney Solari called the next afternoon with the confirmation. Serafina and Theron had taken the bait. The meeting was set for Friday morning, 3 days away, at Solari's office, under the pretense of discussing a mandatory property tax audit that required both my signature and Serafina's as the presumptive heir. The final preparations were meticulous. I would arrive 30 minutes early and wait with Solari and Detective Carr, the financial crimes specialist. Solari had already established a relationship with the bank and the investment firm, ensuring that the moment the confrontation began, the final legal hammer could drop, freezing all assets with immediate effect, rendering any last-minute desperate moves by Theron useless. I spent the remaining days trying to mentally prepare, coaching myself to maintain a poker face, practicing the icy silence I would need to meet their inevitable shock and denial. I wrote a small note for myself, tucking it into my pocket, "Be a Lara, not Mom." This confrontation was not about love or forgiveness, it was about justice, accountability, and self-preservation. That night, the night before the scheduled meeting, I took the cashmere blanket Serafina had left and, with a strange mix of satisfaction and cold fury, I folded it up neatly and dropped it into a heavy-duty trash bag. It was a physical act of severing the final thread of their fake affection, a symbol of discarding their poisoned gift. I knew that the moment I walked into Solari's office, the carefully constructed fantasy of my life with my daughter would shatter completely, leaving only the hard, fractured truth. But I was ready. I was armed with the evidence, protected by the law, and driven by a fierce, undeniable will to survive. I was no longer the frail, unsuspecting grandmother they had planned to erase. I was a Lara Vance, a woman who had meticulously recorded her own betrayal, and the time for the payoff, the grand, painful reveal, was finally at hand. The morning of the confrontation was a crisp, autumn day, the air sharp with the scent of pine needles and impending change. I moved with a calm, almost unnerving clarity, the deep dread of the previous weeks replaced by a laser-like focus. I dressed in a simple, elegant navy dress, the same one I wore to my husband's retirement party, a conscious choice to reclaim a memory of strength and joy before stepping into the crucible of betrayal. I didn't eat, my stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and adrenaline, but I drank a full glass of water, grounding myself in the physical reality of the moment. I reread my note, "Be a Lara, not Mom," a necessary mantra to steel myself against the inevitable emotional manipulation they would attempt. My goal was simple, to remain silent, to let the evidence and the law speak for me, and to ensure the trap was sprung cleanly, with no opportunity for them to escape or sow confusion. Attorney Solari had arranged for a private car service to take me to her office, a necessary precaution to prevent Serafina from noticing my car and realizing I had left the house early. The drive was silent and meditative, giving me a chance to mentally rehearse the scene, anticipating Serafina's feigned surprise, Theron's cold, calculated denial, and the moment the recordings would be played. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and in every scenario, the sheer shock on their faces was the one constant, the one small measure of cold satisfaction I allowed myself to anticipate. They had been so careful, so arrogant in their secrecy, believing that their mother, their Mark, was too old, too simple, and too trusting to ever turn the tables on them. That arrogance, I knew, was their fatal flaw, the crack in their fortress that I had exploited. I arrived at Solari's elegant, modern office building, an environment that immediately felt both professional and intimidating. Solari greeted me warmly, leading me into her spacious conference room where Detective Carr was already waiting. Carr, a quiet, serious man in a dark suit, was introduced as a tax consultant, maintaining the facade of the tax audit meeting. He immediately put me at ease, explaining that his role was purely observational until the moment the evidence was presented, at which point he would formally take charge of the criminal investigation. Solari outlined the procedure one last time. I would sit across from them, Solari would lead the initial discussion, bringing up the financial inconsistencies they had themselves created, and then, at a prearranged signal, the truth would be revealed, the recordings would be played, and the legal documents would be served. The final minutes of waiting were the hardest, a nervous energy thrumming in the sterile silence of the room. Solari checked her watch precisely at the scheduled time, and a minute later, the door opened, and Serafina and Theron walked in. Serafina, dressed impeccably and radiating her usual polished self-importance, gave me a swift, perfunctory air kiss, her eyes already darting to the financial documents scattered on the table. Theron, ever the professional, gave me a polite, shallow nod, his face showing a practiced concern. They took their seats, Serafina across from me, Theron next to her, unknowingly placing themselves directly in the line of fire. They were confident, relaxed, and completely unaware that they had just walked into the center of a perfectly sprung trap, ready to be sprung by the very woman they considered an obsolete, manageable liability. Solari began the meeting with a neutral tone, discussing the fictional property tax inconsistencies they had used as bait. Serafina immediately launched into a well-rehearsed performance, sighing dramatically about the burdens of managing an elderly parent's finances and subtly suggesting that the entire issue could be solved if she simply had full, unmonitored control over my accounts. Theron nodded sagely, reinforcing her claims with technical jargon, casually bringing up my need for assisted oversight. They were walking directly into their own carefully laid snare, providing live evidence of their intent right in front of the detective. I sat motionless, a silent, unwavering observer, meeting Serafina's gaze with a cold, steady look she clearly did not recognize. She seemed confused by my silence, perhaps expecting a nod of agreement or a moment of feigned forgetfulness, but I gave her nothing. The time for acting was over. My heart was still pounding, but my mind was clear, my resolve absolute. It was time for the curtain to rise on the final, devastating act of the play they thought they were directing. The air in the conference room crackled with an unbearable tension that was completely lost on Serafina and Theron, who were too busy gloating over their perceived control of the situation. Solari let Serafina finish her rambling justification about taking over my assets, then interrupted with a polite, razor-sharp authority. "Thank you, Serafina. That explanation is enlightening. However, before we discuss any transfer of assets, there's one small detail about Mrs. Vance's current situation that requires immediate clarification." She paused, her eyes locking onto Serafina's, who was still wearing her smug, impatient smile. This was the moment. Solari didn't need to say anything more. She simply looked down at the sound equipment hidden beneath a stack of files on the table and tapped the surface 3 times, our signal. I watched as Detective Carr, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, straightened in his seat, his gaze fixing on Theron. Solari pressed play. The silence was immediately replaced by the crisp, chilling clarity of Theron's voice, captured just days before in my living room. "She won't need the money for long, Serafina. The doctor gave a guarded prognosis. We just need to accelerate the transfer." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Serafina's face drained of all color, her jaw dropping open in a silent, horrified gasp, her eyes darting wildly between my unmoving face and the hidden speaker. Theron, always quicker to calculate, immediately tensed, his hands clenching into fists on the table, his eyes narrowed with a desperate, feral awareness. The conversation continued, detailing the plan for the friendly financial advisor, Cale, and the strategic draining of the liquid assets. I watched, silent, observing their unraveling, the horrifying, undeniable truth of their own words flooding the room, shattering their carefully constructed facade of concern and duty. When the segment ended, Serafina instantly erupted, screaming, "That's a fabrication. It's edited. Mom, tell them that's not true. You're confused." She turned to me, her betrayal suddenly replaced by a panicked, desperate attempt at manipulation. This was my moment. I met her eyes, held them, and for the first time in months, I spoke the truth without fear, my voice carrying the weight of my 72 years and the strength of my unwavering resolve. "No, Serafina," I said, my voice steady, clear, and utterly cold. "I am not confused. I recorded everything. Every conversation, every detail of your plan to bankrupt me, declare me incompetent, and send me away to that facility 200 miles from here. You used my house as your meeting room, believing your own mother was too old and too stupid to protect herself. I was simply listening, Serafina. And now, you listen to me." Before she could form another word, Solari swiftly slid the manila envelope across the table. Theron, seeing the legal documents and realizing the depth of the trap, attempted to stand, his eyes wild, but Detective Carr was quicker, moving with the practiced efficiency of law enforcement. "Theron, you are under arrest for attempted conspiracy to commit financial fraud and elder abuse," Carr stated, his voice ringing with authority. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the final, devastating payoff, the ultimate closure to months of terror and deception. Serafina watched her husband being restrained, his cruel facade finally shattering, and then turned back to me, not with remorse, but with a sudden, devastating realization of her own ruin. Solari was already on the phone with the bank, initiating the final, permanent freeze and the criminal filing against Cale and the investment firm. I left the office an hour later, not in the car that brought me, but with my own 2 feet, walking towards a brighter, more certain future. Serafina and Theron were gone, their plot neutralized, their immediate future in the hands of the law. I had won, not by fighting, but by listening, by gathering the undeniable truth, and by trusting my own instincts. The financial integrity of my life was restored, my house was safe, and my dignity was completely, irrevocably reclaimed. The profound sadness of losing my only daughter to her own greed will always remain, a quiet ache in my heart, but it is now overshadowed by a powerful, enduring sense of self-respect. I am Alara Vance, and I survived the ultimate betrayal. I recorded everything, and that recording saved my life. I hope my story, my dear friends, serves as a solemn warning and a fierce encouragement. Never underestimate the power of quiet observation, the importance of knowing your worth, and the strength of a grandmother with nothing left to lose. Always trust your gut, and if something feels wrong, don't confront, just listen, gather the truth, and wait for the perfect moment to execute your own final, glorious payoff. If this story resonated with you, please don't hesitate to like this video, and subscribe to the channel so we can share more with each other. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from.